Yeah, okay. Thank you. Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a developmental psychologist, so I'm not really an expert on addiction. So I'll be referring to addiction, of course, as the outcome of interest, but I'll be speaking mainly about the early determinants or the early predictions of engagement in substance use. And my bias is for developmental processes, and I think that will show. Let me try this. Yes. The starting point of my talk is, as already alluded to, the report that was produced that I had the honor of co-presiding with my late colleague, Clyde Hertzman, someone who was very esteemed among the early childhood development community, who unfortunately, very sadly died a few months ago. The report was produced last November, so we will celebrate the first year soon. The question that were asked in the report was essentially the role of early childhood experiences or adverse early childhood experiences in development. So we were asked to kind of review the evidence concerning the role of these types of experience, and I'm referring to all kinds of experience going from low SES, poverty to maltreatment on different kinds of outcomes, including addictions. We were also asked to cover the processes that might be involved, and as well as cover what can be done to mitigate. And for this, we specifically focused on child maltreatment. This is my 10-cent trial, resuming or summarizing, what the field is trying to do with respect to maladjustment. So it's a very general graph. There's a lot of information, starting with the centerpiece, which is individual trajectories. So what we're trying to do really is to describe those trajectories, and trajectories can be described in a variety of ways. Essentially, dimensions of the child that can yield individual differences and have developmental meaning. So we're asking many questions about developmental trajectories. First is the description, what kind of trajectories, and I'll be can we assess across development, and I'll be alluding to this later in my talk. We're trying to predict from these trajectories all kinds of good things or bad things, essentially bad things here, including substance abuse. So the goal of developmental psychology and developmental psychopathology is to understand the processes leading from early individual trajectories to later maladjustment. And we're trying to do this across development. And we're interested in predicting, understanding the determinants. And the dominant, I would say the dominant paradigm is one in which we're looking at gene-environment interactions. It's a dominant paradigm since certainly 15 years now. And there's a lot of information, research that has been generated along this line. So we learned in the last years, maybe 15 years, a lot about how individual trajectories can predict to later outcomes. We now have major longitudinal research that extend well into adulthood, spanning 40 years, where the link between early trajectories and early adversities is certainly established between all kinds of outcomes. And we're now interested in looking at the sensitive period defined by the 0 to 6 period. We learned a great deal about the gene-environment interactions. I'll be alluding to this a little later in my talk. And of course, we're interested in all kinds of environmental features, parents, of course, and peers. And we also learned in the last 15 years a lot about the biological basis for behavior. We know more about the brain systems and networks that underlie those individual trajectories. So there was many gains in knowledge in the last 15 years. So we tried to cover this in the report. Now, there are some defining features for a developmental framework on substance abuse use. I think that everyone would agree that it's clear that there are identified brain pathways and systems that are associated with the substance use and abuse, namely one of for which we have maybe the most evidence for is the dopamine system. It's an open system, so these are bidirectional. The dopamine system is certainly affected by, as well as it affects the substance, the tendency to use substance. One defining feature too is the fact that there are substantial contribution of genetic factors. We find that all across the board in the literature for many kinds of addictions, but also for gambling problems. And perhaps one unique feature of this is of substance use and abuse is the fact that we have substantial co-occurrences across different forms of abuse. And so that leads to the question of examining the factors underlying. And when you do this in a genetically informed way, you find a lot of genetic influence on comorbidities or co-occurrences of substance use and abuse. So that leads to the point or the possibility of that there would be a core set of biological vulnerabilities for a general syndrome of addiction or substance abuse. People have suggested behavioral inhibition as one possibility, and more recently there's some evidence that self-control, which is kind of analog to behavioral disinhibition, is involved too, and I'll be presenting some data on this, recent data on this. The links with adversity, well, the evidence is mixed. Our reading of the literature is that yes, the connections are there. There's a clear connection between adversities defined as prenatal exposition to prenatal alcohol and nicotine, low SES, and maltreatment. But this is a correlation where the developmental processes are not clear. There's a few twins adoption studies that fail to document an environmental pathway in substance use abuse across generations, which tend to suggest that if there's a link, the link is driven by genetic factors. But at the same time, you also have some early preventive interventions that have shown positive effects. And these interventions tend to be very general, but in many cases they show, and these are randomized experiments, so very solid experimentally, and they show real protective effects in terms of substance use and abuse. And I've listed some of them, maybe some of you are familiar with them. I would like to bring 3 additional points for a full and refined developmental approach to substance use and abuse. So that was the report. This is my thinking about it right now as I was preparing this talk. First, so 3 points. Substance use and abuse should be conceived as a developmental construct. The story is more in the developmental trajectories rather than episodic assessment of substance use and abuse. So I'll be making this point. Early risk factors should be documented, of course, that's why I'm here. And I'll be showing some data suggesting that you can have really reliable indices showing that some kids are more at risk for substance use and abuse, essentially centering on self-control dimensions or sub-dimensions. And we should also document gene-environment interplay more systematically. First point, so substance use as a developmental construct. This is data stemming from one of our longitudinal study in Montreal. This is my colleague who did the study. I wasn't involved. But essentially, they've asked questions about substance use, alcohol here, and marijuana over time. And you look, you ran what we call trajectory analysis, and they were able to identify, in each case, 3 trajectories. So the message here is that you would get, kind of heterogeneous. If you were centering, say, on this side here of the equation, when the kids are 11 and 12, you would get mixed together children who will later develop some use of alcohol, whereas you would have a minority of kids who would stay without alcohol, or would not use alcohol. So the point here is that if we really want a real developmental approach, we need to measure it longitudinally and target on the trajectories instead of measuring it period by period. Same for marijuana. They were able to find 3 trajectories, and some of them are late starters, but they don't show any signs of consumption of marijuana at 11, 12, and 13. So I think it's important to get that message, that to have a clearer picture, a clearer developmental picture of use, you need longitudinal data. Early risk factors, there was a recent paper published in 2012 by Tammy Moffitt and her group that's the Dunedin study, a famous longitudinal study that started when the kids were 5 years, and they've been following them up to age 40, 38. They have assessed the children when they were 38. The nice thing about this longitudinal study is that they have very low attrition, so they were able to reevaluate year after year children, and they have something like 96% participation still 38 years after the start of the study. This is an interesting one because they focused on self-control. They defined self-control as an umbrella construct where you assess emotional liability, low frustration tolerance. It's a kind of a generic construct where you have signs of hyperactivity, signs of problem with emotional control, signs of problem with aggression. And they combine these scores, and they've assessed the relation between these scores assessed while the kids were in primary school, more or less, and they've assessed them later when they were adults, and the graphs clearly show that there is a monotonic association between the lack of self-control and substance abuse. So it's interesting to see that, over 30 years of follow-up, you have these associations. The problem with this is that the Dunedin study is fairly blind in terms of early childhood. There's a new generation of cohorts that were started some years ago, some of which are being run in Quebec, where we try to focus. We started when the kids, they called birth cohort. We tried to focus in the early years. We have a lot of assessment, repeated assessment over the preschool years. There were 2 of them that we are running. There are 2 of them that we are running in Quebec. One is a representative sample of the Quebec population, singletons, essentially QLSCD, 2,000 of them, still being followed, and QNTS, which is a twin study, a smaller group centered around Montreal, but assessed regularly over the years. So when you do this, you're able, because we have repeated measurement, you can assess trajectories, but early trajectories. And I'm showing here you 4 trajectories that were assessed in preschool, on which we have published. And I would like you to bring your attention to the first 2 ones, physical aggression and hyperactivity, which in a way are subcategories or subdimensions of a dimension that could be self-control. And for all of them, but in particular for these 2 ones, you see that very early on you have a subsample, systematically a subsample of kids showing high aggression, high hyperactivity compared to the others. So there's individual differences appear very early. They tend to be stable. They're not you don't find any groups crisscrossing, across time. Essentially, individual differences are there very early and tend to be stable in the pre-years. And they predict, of course, two outcomes. We don't have the outcomes when they are adult. They will be adult soon, so we're following them up, so we'll be able to connect these trajectories. But the message here is that trajectories are established very early. And trajectories of dimensions likely involved in the self-control construct in a way that predicts to addictions. Okay. These trajectories are associated with a host of risk factors reflecting adversity. So the message, again, this is for aggression. Don't have time to go over all the dimensions, but essentially it's a collection of risk factors going from being male to family dysfunction. There's no single bullet. It's a collection of things having to do with family and child factors and parental factors. So G interplay in development, the challenge of complexity in inter-individual variability. Essentially, when we do a twin research, I don't know if you're familiar with the twin design, but essentially twins are exceptionally a gift for developmental researchers in the sense that you have two kids, growing up in the same family, so you can follow them and then assess not only between family differences, but also within family differences. And these within family differences are huge. So they're very important, and when you do singleton study, you cannot assess this. So it's interesting by itself, but the additional value of having twins is that they come at least in two kinds, if you go simple. Essentially, monozygotic share 100% of their genes, and dizygotic twins, fraternal twins, on average share 50% of their genes. So by comparing similarities of monozygotic versus dizygotic twins, we have a handle to assess genetic effects. That's the logic behind the twin design. So essentially, when you get this differential, these are interclass correlations, very simple statistics. You compute interclass correlation for monozygotics. This is aggression, essentially assessed in kindergarten. When you do this, you get a correlation of 0.67 versus 0.34, and the difference between the two correlations suggests that there are genetic effects. And if you do some modeling of that, you can do the quantitative splitting of the variance typical of the ACE model, where you assess gene effects, what we share shared environment, what is associated with the fact that the two kids share the same family, controlling for genes, and then unique, what makes every children unique. And when you do this kind of analysis, you get that kind of result, a AE pattern where essentially similarity among twins is essentially associated with the fact that they share genes, shared environment, very low contribution, if not zip, and then, of course, unique environment is always important. So that's interesting, but it's only the start of the story. Because it's very simple. We need to qualify the genetic contribution to substance use as a function of context. It has to be repeated. Heritability points to vulnerability and resilience, not to destiny. They are not fixed entities. They may apply, they may not apply to some developmental period, so there's likely to be a variation in the gene etiology depending on the developmental period. They may not apply to a specific societal group. It is the statistics attached to a population, and they may not apply to contexts where the environment may constrain individual choices. And maybe more importantly, heritability likely hide the role of environment in more complex gene-environment transactions such as G correlations and G interactions. And we're starting to show some of this type of complex gene-environment transactions in different research. So this is an example of, again, taken from our twin sample, age 13, showing exactly that for substance use in the sense that you have some heritability, but the heritability is fairly low compared to what we find usually This is the age where, children initiate substance use, age 13, 12, 13. And so you have a shared environment, which is that we don't find really often. You have a shared environment, significant, and of course which is significant. We also did the analysis for gambling, where you find you have a huge differential between monozygotic and dizygotic in terms of similarity, which suggests strong genetic effect for initiating gambling. Now, substance use, you're at an age where maybe peers are very important, family, neighborhood context may be more important. So we need to do more of this, assessing the heritability and the role of shared and unique environment at different points in time. This is interesting too. It's not about substance use. This is 18 months cortisol assayed during exposition to novelty. The point I'm bringing here is that we did that. We computed the usual twin correlations in the context of adversity versus in the context of non-adversity. And here we're finding that in the context of adversity, we're finding a strong genetic effect. So essentially, reaction to novelty, as expressed in the cortisol response of the kid, is essentially accounted for by genes and unique environment. Whereas in the context of adversity, it is as if the environment associated with adversity would override the genetic effect. And then what you find is a strong shared environment effect. So again, the GE etiology varies as a function of the milieu. It's important to take that into account and go for those, try to understand those gene-environment interactions. So the challenge, that's my last one. The challenge of the new science of ECD for understanding substance use. We need to do more of description, so describing developmental processes from birth. It's a huge undertaking because we need more of these early longitudinal study that goes on into adulthood. So it's a long-term investment. There's a challenge of complexity in understanding the processes, the gene-environment interplay. I haven't touched on the question of biological embedding of early experience, the new stuff about epigenetics that is pointing its nose very decisively in our field. How much, when, where, how predictive are those processes how predictive they are in terms of predicting negative outcomes, accounting for individual differences over time, and also the challenge of assessing multiple levels of biosocial integration. We need to build at the end an early developmental framework for prevention, because the early signs are there, and we need to understand what works in interventions. And finally, the biggest challenge of all is to bring this new knowledge in a format so that we would inform policy and services. So thank you for your attention.